Hello, folks. It is me, as always, your host, Shingima Vima, and we're continuing today with our Intro to African History series. And this is the third in our mini-series of the overthrow of colonialism. And today we're focusing on Southern Africa. Now, in case you're wondering what that little song was about in the beginning, that's a Zimbabwean song by the legendary Mbira musician. Her name is Stella Chiweshe. And it's called Chachi Murenga, which is a reference to the Zimbabwean armed struggle, particularly the second armed struggle against colonialism. So, and we'll talk more about the Chimurenga as we go along, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. So without further ado, let's get started. And let me just emphasize, as I do always, that this is part of an intro series, the equivalent of a 101 to African history. So we'll be uploading more videos of more in-depth issues going forward, but this one is part of that intro series. And without further ado, let us get started. And share my screen. And there it is, folks. We are cooking with gas. So the first thing I want to emphasize here is that in earlier videos, I've spoken about how 1960 is widely known as the year of Africa. Because while we had a few countries such as Ghana in 1957, Libya even before then, that had obtained their independence in the aftermath of the Second World War, the bulk of countries got their independence in 1960. That is when the French relented. So there's, 13, I believe, French colonies that received their independence in 1960. Add to that number the likes of Nigeria and some of the Belgian colonies as well that received their independence within that year. Now, when you say the year of Africa, it is very important that we remember that this was not so for one particular region of the continent, and that is Southern Africa. Why is that? Well, first of all, the Portuguese, having been a smaller empire compared to the French and the British and the likes, they were eager to hold on to their foreign territories, as if, when the others started to relent due to imperial fatigue in the aftermath of the Second World War. So they wanted to hold on to their colonies, and it so happened that some of their prominent colonies were in the southern part of the continent, mainly Mozambique and Angola. So that's the Portuguese. South Africa is already an apartheid state. So even though it is quote unquote independent as far as not being part of an empire, it is apartheid. It is run by the minority white settlers, and the black people have little to no franchise and citizenry within their own territory. The Southern Rhodesia, which is modern day Zimbabwe, is itself a settler colony, even though it's still part of the British Empire at this time. But settler empires are tricky because you have to get all these people out and all these things. So still, that is also still a colony. So I say this to say, and Namibia is in a similar boat to South Africa. So Southern Africa by 1960, by and large, was nowhere close to being independent. So that's what we're talking about today. And I'll see you guys at the end. Now, as African nationalism began to rise, and the British were still trying to figure it out in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the British were still trying to figure out how to hold on to these things, they thought about, how about if we can unify, if you will, build a federation of 3 countries, right, that were British, under British control, and that is Southern Rhodesia, which was their main settler colony, with more than 200,000 at the time, 200,000 white settlers, right? Northern Rhodesia, which had some white settlers, but was not as prototypical settler colony like Southern Rhodesia, which is modern-day Zambia, and Nyasaland. What if we bring them together in federation? That way, we can, one, we will be able to leverage our economic power in very much in a similar way to what South Africa does as a bigger country, as a bigger state. And secondly, we can offer little franchise and little autonomy to the different African groups. That way we can placate them and sort of preempt the rise of African nationalism. So the three countries that were brought in were, of course, Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, Northern Rhodesia, modern-day Zambia, and Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi. Now, as they had suspected, the Union brought about a economic boom for the white settlers, right? Rhodesia continued to serve as, Southern Rhodesia, I mean, continued to serve as the center, not geographically, of course, as you can tell from here. And this is the flag of the federation here. It was the center of industry, okay? The center of industry and sort of the administrative center. It was the capital of the federation, if you will. Northern Rhodesia is known for its copper mines and other resources, so it allowed the community to tap into those as well. The Nyasaland became a very popular site for labor, so a lot of people from modern-day Malawi migrated to Southern Rhodesia to work in the factories and on the farms. And what that does to this day, you know, and I'm from Zimbabwe myself, so there's a large number of people who migrated from Malawi. Now, because of linguistic similarities, and of course, you know, for the most part, we look the same. You can't, you know, they're Zimbabweans through and through, and a lot of them most of them speak Shona or Ndebele or their relative Zimbabwean language. But it's every now and then that you see a last name that you may have assumed was a Shona last name, which is a Zimbabwean language, only to find out later, like, oh no, that's actually a name that was popularized by, you know, it's a Nyanja name or Chewa name that came from Malawi and has been made popular in Southern Rhodesia. In any case, so that is part of the legacy of this. So there was an economic boom for whites as they arranged it that way. They were able to tap into the labor, into the natural resources. They gave good tax breaks to the white settlers and all these things. For the black people, it was not so, it did the opposite, right? It did quite the opposite, which was to say, on one hand, because remember I said Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland they were protectorates, they were not colonies, and they were also not settler states, right? So previously, even though they were under the thumb of the British, the black people in those spaces, the African people in those spaces had more self-determination. Now that they were under the control of the Southern Rhodesians, if you will, okay, that meant that they were under the stringent thumbs, which were very similar to, which were apartheid conditions, right? So that really displeased the African nationalists in Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia. And there's a great quote here that I want to visit from Herring Kumbula, who was one of the leaders of the anti-colonial movement in Northern Rhodesia, who says, "Of all the Europeans of Central Africa, those of Southern Rhodesia have the worst antipathy towards Africans. They look upon Africans as the inferior beings with no right to a dignified and refined existence and fit only as hewers of wood and drawers of water for Europeans. In all their dealings with the Africans, they always assume the attitude of conquerors. It is these Europeans who will rule and govern their freedom under the government provided by Southern Rhodesia. The relationship between us and the authorities will be one of slaves and masters and the cardinal principle of domination." So you can tell that they were shaken by being brought into this federation. Now, the nationalists in southern Rhodesia, modern day Zimbabwe, were shaken as well, but they knew they're Europeans, if you will. So they were not as razzled in the same way, but they were very razzled. And we see that they were razzled because, and we'll talk. So that's what I'll talk about briefly. So that was the socio-political impact, but also because the white people, the white settlers were getting the Europeans were getting all these breaks in taxes and these things. There was a large economic boom for them, which was not present for the Africans, right? Who suffered from frozen wage levels in the face of a rising cost of living, of course, being associated with economic booms. And strikes became commonplace. And all this led to an upsurge in African nationalism across the board, right? African nationalism across the board, with organizations such as the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, founded in 1957, which became which changed names in a couple of years and also got banned. And such that so important was this wave that in 1964, the British government decided, you know what, this wasn't worth it anymore. The activism of the African nationalists across the board were hitting a fever pitch. So in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, both those countries became independent in 1964. Now, ideally, the British were also going to let Rhodesia become independent, Southern Rhodesia become independent, right? And move to majority rule. But there was that small issue of it being a settler colony. So what did the settler colony do? It decides to go alone as a UDI, which by way of what is called the UDI, which was the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965. What does that mean? It means that Southern Rhodesia seceded from the British Empire and set up its own colony, becoming only the second country to do so after the USA did it some 2 centuries earlier. So Rhodesia became this, it was a white settler colony, but it was no longer part of the British Empire. It seceded and had its own flag, you know, which resembled the Nigerian flag. I should have put it on here, but with the with the Rhodesian insignia in the middle. So that's what we'll talk about, how a small country like that can even secede, and in an increasingly hostile area because its neighbors are independent now. How were they able to survive, and what happened in the following decade or so? This is what we'll talk about. So the advent of the now called Rhodesia, because remember it was called Southern Rhodesia because Northern Rhodesia existed, but now Northern Rhodesia has become independent and is now called Zambia. Southern Rhodesia adopts the name Rhodesia under the leadership of Ian Smith and has seceded from the British Empire. So it became an apartheid state. No, it was no different from an apartheid state. If anything, they existed symbiotically with South Africa at the time, which was the prototypical apartheid state, of course. And the other thing I forgot to mention was that during the Federation years, 1953 to 1963, some of the African activists had hoped in Southern Rhodesia, the likes of Joshua Nkomo and Ndabaningi Stole, had hoped that this would mean that they get more influence, political influence, but they just got peace, influence, so they were not satisfied. So that's why they founded the nationalist organizations and got even more frustrated. And when the UDI was declared, things got even tougher for Black people, right? The racism and the segregation and the marginalization only increased across all the boards. So as a result of that, earlier in the early 1960s, 2 nationalist groups have been founded. First was the Zimbabwean African People's Union, known as ZAPU. Then from then on, there was a split, and the Zimbabwean African National Union was founded, ZAPU and ZANU, the second one being founded by Ndabaningi Stole, and it would go on to, both those would go on to define the struggle with their so those were political parties, and their military wings were known as ZIPRA, that was the ZAPU military wing, Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army. Then ZANLA was the ZANU wing, known as Zimbabwean African National Liberation Association, ZANLA. Army. And they established their bases in neighboring countries. Remember, the countries are becoming independent. So they were able to establish bases in Zambia prominently. They were able to establish bases in Tanzania, famously in Tanzania. And the first battle for independence, right now, they're armed to fight for their independence because they see that the Rhodesians have split from the British and they're not willing to negotiate this. We're going to have to fight our way out of this. So the first battle, what largely documented as the first battle, though history debates this, was in 1966 at Chinoi. And this battle is known as the birth of the Second Chimurenga, where I believe the militants, the 7 militants who got that started, brought down a helicopter, a Rhodesian helicopter. That's getting the struggle started. And the war would rage for a decade or so, and a lot could be said about this. However, Rhodesia was ready, despite its valiant attempts. And for the first few years, for a country that was a small country that had seceded from the empire and in hostile territory, they actually held on pretty well. They did their thing, but they soon succumbed to different factors. One of which was the violence of the Chimurenga had taken its toll. More than 20,000 people had died as a result of the struggle. And as it went into the 1970s, later into the 1970s, the violence was only increasing, right? International sanctions was another thing. The British, of course, had imposed sanctions on this Wantaway country. Other countries as well. The US had established sanctions. Just the international community had established sanctions against this minority oppressive government, right? Finally, their main ally in the region had been South Africa. Why? Because they have very similar system of government, right? White settler communities in an apartheid system, and in an increasingly hostile surroundings, where, if anything, the African militants in those countries are setting up bases in the neighboring countries. So South Africa for a long time had bagged Rhodesia. If anything, was a large part of why it even survived through trade and financing. However, South Africa was afraid that as the war was raging on and the Rhodesia looked like it was about to collapse, ZANU, which was communist Marxist allied at the time, right, getting backing from China, for example, they were afraid that would be the group that comes into power if they allowed the war to rage on. So South Africa encourages Rhodesia to negotiate such that moderate African nationalists, the likes of Bishop Abel Muzorewa would take control, would come into power, thereby making sure that the country stays capitalist and the Rhodesians sort of continue to pull the strings behind the scenes. But also there are black faces and some semblance of democracy in the country, which led to what was called the 1978 compromise, through which the talks happened, and the moderates, the likes of Abel, led by Abel Muzorewa, took power, and the country changed its name to Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Weird country with a last name like that. But of course, the nationalists, the likes of the ZAPU and ZANU leaders, who at the time were Joshua Nkomo for ZAPU and Robert Mugabe for ZANU, rejected this. They could tell that this was bogus. This was a a weak compromise way to just shut them down. So they rejected it, and the fighting only escalated from there until, you know what, this has gotten out of hand. The British came in and convinced the Rhodesians to come to the negotiating table once and for all and move towards majority rule, right? Majority rule. So in December of 1979, the Lancaster House negotiations occurred in London, and these brought to the table the British, the Rhodesian leadership, the ZAPU leadership, the ZANU leadership, as well as members of that Zimbabwe-Rhodesia compromise interim government. And based on those negotiations, it was agreed that Zimbabwe would move to democratic majority rule the following year in 1980, where, with some compromises, of course, such as of the 100 parliamentary seats, 20 would still be reserved for white Rhodesians, if you will, at least for the first 5 to 7 years. And that's a topic for another day. We'll talk about independent Zimbabwe going forward, but this is how Zimbabwe got its independence in 1980 in a nutshell. Earlier, I explained that Portugal was not willing to let go of its territories, right? Because they felt that with the French and the British relenting, this was a way in which they could, their empire could even surge forward and catch up with their neighbors, but or at least remain competitive, right? So this was the opportunity. So they held on to their territories. They had several territories, including Angola and Mozambique, as mentioned earlier, but they also had Cape Verde, the islands of Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau, right? So, but the Africans were not with it. They had seen the independence of all their French neighbors in 1960. Some of the prominent countries like Ghana, Nigeria are independent now by the 1960s. Even their Southern African neighbors like Zambia and Malawi have gotten independence by 1964. So they start revving up, right? And in 1956, it was a nationalist named Amilcar Cabral, who was actually from Cape Verde, who founded the PAIGC, which stands for the Partido Africano de Independencia de Guinea, Cabo Verde, right? So it's like the African Party for the Independence of Cape Verde and Guinea, all right? And he would go on to organize. Initially, they tried to strike and call for better rights, but that was crushed. So they got even more disappointed and engaged in warfare. Now, the PAIGC between 1963 and 1973, and it raged in Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. And they would liberate state by state, city by city, community by community. And by 1973, so much of mainland Guinea had been liberated that the PAIGC was able to declare an independent state. This was, as these things would have it, in 1973, after this had happened, Amilcar Cabral was assassinated. But this was not enough, even though he was assassinated in January of 1974. So it means he did not live enough to see the final withdrawal of the Portuguese troops in September of that same year. However, the job was done. Now, during this time, the Portuguese general who led the resistance, who tried to keep Cabral down, was a general named General Spinola, who, as the time went on, he became convinced that the war could not be won. So he realized that continuing the war against PAIGC, as well as other groups in Angola and Mozambique, was draining the Portuguese economy dry. So this is important because the Portuguese government in Lisbon is sitting pretty, thinking that this empire is beneficial and it's a good look. However, General Spinola, the Portuguese general on the ground fighting against Cabral, can see that this is actually draining us. So it was largely these African liberation wars that prompted Spinola and a group of army officers to topple their country's dictatorship in a military coup d'etat in Portugal in April 1974. So if anything, it can be argued then that Africa's liberation movements helped liberate Portugal from the dictatorship. And in turn, the coup in Lisbon led to directly to Portuguese military withdrawal from Africa and the independence of Angola and Mozambique in 1975. So we've seen that in Southern Africa with the failure of the Central African Federation in 1963. In the following year, Malawi and Zambia become independent. And now we've seen that, and that same year, Rhodesia declares itself separate from the empire, but doesn't become independent as a Black African country until 1980. Then in 1975, we see the independence of Angola and Mozambique. Now, the boogeyman in all this was South Africa. As we've spoken about before, South Africa is an interesting case because it was never a colony per se in the way of it being part of the larger empire. It was as early as 1910, after the Anglo-Boer Wars or the South African Wars, it was declared an independent state, quote unquote. But however, it was an independent state as the Union of South Africa, which catered only for the white people who were predominantly the Dutch and British descendants who had fought in the previous years, but now had united as this group. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, as African nationalism was on the rise, because remember, the early nationalist organizations in South Africa had been moderate, trying to negotiate their way into franchise and being respected by the powers that be. But by the 1940s, for the same reasons that other groups are getting more radical, they too, the South African government, the white South African government, had the presence of mind to say, you know what, if we let this go on, there'll be an uprising and we'll, might as well be overthrown. So what they set in place in 1948 was what the system of apartheid. The system of apartheid grew out of the aftermath of the Second World War. And what the system is, it's a codified system of racial segregation as a law. In the US, we had Jim Crow laws, and in many ways that is that sort of thing where there are laws against intermarriages, against people living in the same areas, right? The Homeland Acts, we had the Shared Areas Act, these sort of things where you could not use the same locker room, you could not, Black people could not be in certain areas without a letter from their employer. So that became the apartheid system since the beginning in 1948. And in 1955, nationalists, right, a big group of them got together and I have a little bit of this story here. In 1952, right, the African National Congress, which is the original party founded in 1912 and is the party that's still in power today, the party of Nelson Mandela and the likes. The party, ANC led the Defiance Campaign, the first mass protest against these apartheid laws. The campaign brought together a collective that grew to be called the Congress Alliance. comprising of organizations committed to bringing about majority rule, non-racialism, and the principle of one person, one vote. Led by the ANC, the alliance comprised of such groups as the South African Congress of Democrats, South African Indian Congress, Colored People's Congress, South African Congress of Trade Unions, South African Communist Party, and the Federation of South African Women. So 10,000 protesters were arrested during the defiance campaign. And so this is showing, this is in 1952. We're working our way up to the Freedom Charter. On the 25th of June in 1955, almost 3,000 delegates from across South Africa, representing the different organizations of the Congress Alliance, gathered in Johannesburg. And out of this came this document that was known as the Freedom Charter, which was regarded as a triumph, right? And its utopian ideals maintain resonance up until the advent of democracy and beyond. So this is the link here, and I'll put it in the description section as well. While many South Africans applauded the charter, right, because one of the it was beautiful. If you read it, it is very flowery and beautiful and idealistic. But while many South Africans applauded the charter, some of the people of the ANC, especially the younger people of the ANC who were more radical, were particularly concerned with many of its provisions. Chief among them, this claim that South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, black and white, which didn't sit right with them, right? Because they are, for the past 50 years, if not more, they have been treated as non-citizens, as secondary, third-class citizens within their own territory. So how conciliatory is it that their revolutionary thing is, oh, South Africa belongs to us as it belongs to our oppressor? Their standpoint was Africa's for Africans, which was the Garveyist sort of claim, right? Marcus Garvey's slogan, Africa for Africans. How can we confront these people who oppress us and really are killing us and arresting us wantonly with a compromise that says this land belongs to you as well? So they were particularly, the more radical group, they were not with it. And this ideological drift continued to grow until 1958, when the Africanists, right, this group of radicals we call the Africanists, broke away from the ANC, paving way for the formation of the Pan-African Congress. That's the PAC I talk about here, under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe. This platform provided an opportunity for some critics of the Freedom Charter to express their concerns. And one of the things that what they were concerned about was that the Congress of the People that led to the Freedom Charter had not been an African initiative at all, but had been sponsored by a small group of white Marxists under the guiding hand of Lionel Rusty Bernstein, who, as the name suggests, was a Jewish individual in South Africa. So, and this is a quote from one of the Africanists. So now we have two parties, right? We have the ANC, which is the more moderate, multiracialist, we can all live together. Then the Pan-African Congress, which is more, you know what, now we need to get these folks out of here. This is not working for us. Both groups, however, took part in, on 21 March 1960, the PAC marched on the Sharpeville police station in southern Johannesburg. The police descended upon them with ruthless abandon, shooting 69 people and injuring 200. In the aftermath of Sharpeville, the South African government banned both the ANC and the PAC. Right, so both groups were banned, which led to a period known as the post-Sharpeville NADIR, which I'll talk about shortly. So some of you may know this word NADIR, or some people say NADIR, but NADIR, which literally just means the great nothing. We talk about this in American history in the period after the Reconstruction era, right? After slaves are freed, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Then there's the Reconstruction era after that. Then when that's shut down, we call it the NADIR period. That's in American history to say the period in which no progress. If anything, we went backwards. And that's the same thing with the post-Sharpeville NADIR and the aftermath of 1960 in South Africa, where all the momentum that had been gained by the ANC and the Freedom Charter, as well as the PAC breaking away and advocating for even more radical standpoint. And now the parties are banned, and the country goes into an era of emergency, becomes an emergency settlement. Not much progress happens. The activism dies. So this next decade is known as the post-Sharpeville NADIR of African nationalism in South Africa. After both the parties were banned, they were forced to operate underground and in exile. ANC leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada were arrested between 1962 and 1963 before standing before the court at Rivonia in 1964. Sobukwe, who was the leader of the PAC, was arrested after the Sharpeville massacre for inciting a public uprising. Restricted in activity by the ban and having been failed by their non-violent protest, both PAC and ANC formed guerrilla units. In 1961, Umkhonto weSizwe, MK, was formed. Which means the Spear of the Nation, and that's their insignia here. The Spear of the Nation was formed by the ANC. And it was under Mandela's leadership, and it became famous for its sabotage campaign, in which they would blow up railway lines, electricity distribution sites, and government offices. And POCO was the PAC equivalent of that, right? Which was also very active. It was very short-lived. And also, like the other parties, they also set up bases in Tanzania, Zambia, and other African countries that have become independent. However, the POCO and MK were not as successful as, say, ZANU and ZAPU in Zimbabwe were, for several reasons. Including South Africa's, has less borders, because the rest of it is the ocean, and the northern borders are pretty well secured. South Africa is a more urban society, which has more urban emphasis, whereas a lot of these wars, like Frelimo in Mozambique and ZANU and ZAPU, they fought these as sort of bush wars, right? Which rested heavily. Same thing with the Mau Mau in Kenya, which rested heavily in the rural areas, whereas South Africa is a more urban space, so that makes it a little bit harder to have this sort of guerrilla style warfare. The people of South Africa, the white South Africans were also empowered, so a lot of them were armed, and these sort of things. Things like that. Of course, the past laws and the state of emergency meant that, movements were very well regulated. So these were all the sort of things that made it very difficult for MK and POCO to be successful in fighting. So the numbers that were casualties of the MK and POCO are significantly lower than it is of the nationalist movements in the other countries. This is not to downplay their sacrifice or anything like that. It's just the way in which it played out in South Africa, where the South African state had a strong hold on these things. But while the NADIR is going on, the Black consciousness movement comes into play, right? And we'll talk about that shortly. The post-Sharpeville NADIR created a leadership void in the fight against apartheid. The vacuum was soon filled by the Black consciousness movement, also known as the BSM, most notably associated with Steve Biko's leadership, and that's him here, pictured here. Influenced in part by the Black Power movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, SNCC, in the USA, as well as the writings of the likes of Cabral, who we just spoke about, and Frantz Fanon, Black consciousness sought, and I quote, to oppose, reverse, and undo the long history of the dehumanization and emptying of being of Africans. So that was the movement that was started by that BIKO was on the forefront of, starting in the late 1960s and all the way into the 1970s. And the big thing with this Black consciousness movement was it started in schools, right? With the South African Students Organization, SASO, and these sort of spaces. And it made a lot of its activism by way of writing. They used to publish a newsletter, and he himself, Steve Biko, used to write under the pen name Frank Talk. So it was an urban movement, but one that was centered around students. It wasn't initially, anyway. It wasn't very militant. It was militant, if you can imagine the militancy of a radical student group, right? Much in the form of the likes of SNCC and other Black Power organizations in the U.S. And it had such an impact. It had such an impact. It also didn't stick to that. It was also very involved in things like building clinics and other such activities. So that was the Black consciousness movement that was led by Steve Biko. And I must emphasize, right, that at this time, the likes of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, they are serving their long prison sentences that wouldn't end until the late 1980s, those 27-year prison sentences and the likes. So Steve Biko emerges as one of the leaders at this point. Now, because this was a student-led movement, one of the main protests that grew out, and this is not to say the Black consciousness movement led this. This was an organic moment in Soweto, South Africa, which is in Johannesburg. It's a word made up from the word Southwest Township. So when you initialize that, you get Soweto. Is the biggest township, or the biggest, if you will, for lack of a better term, the biggest low-income neighborhood, or if I was to be very crass about it, it's the biggest ghetto in South Africa for sure, in Southern Africa for sure. It might be the biggest in Africa altogether, but in any case, it's huge. And from that community, the apartheid government was mandating that the students learn not just learn Afrikaans, the language, but be taught in Afrikaans, to have Afrikaans as the main language of instruction. Now, I don't know if I've explained in previous videos what Afrikaans is, but Afrikaans is the Dutch derived language that, let's rewind a little bit. So as the Dutch community that first settled in South Africa in the 1650s had established and developed a character that was Dutch, because that's where they're from, but also now very of the land, right? The Boers, and they've been in South Africa for a few centuries now. They've now developed this distinct national identity or nationalistic identity that was further cemented by the Great Trek of the 1800s, and now they call themselves the Afrikaners. Afrikaners spelled Afrikaners, Afrikaners, and their language, which is the Dutch variant that became their language in South Africa. It's Dutch but mixed in with elements of local languages and some English and these things. It became known as Afrikaans. That's what we're talking about when we talk about Afrikaans. And that was also the group largely responsible for establishing the apartheid state. The government that governed throughout apartheid was mainly Afrikaners. So they were mandating that the students be that Afrikaans be the chief language of instruction. Now, why would they do that? Well, it was a debilitating move, right? Because Afrikaans is a language only spoken in South Africa, and not by a large part of South Africa, just by the Dutch descendant population of South Africa. Now, of course, a lot of people have learned the language over the years, but that is the community out of which it strives. Okay, it is not spoken across the continent. You know, the only relatable language is Dutch, which is not even a major language, with all due respect, of course, on the national, on the international sphere. So, and also these kids do not grow up speaking Afrikaans in their homes, the African kids, because remember, in the era of apartheid, they're living in their separate communities. So they're only meeting this language for the first time in school. Recipe for failure, right? And it also means that they stay isolated, insulated away from people across the continent who are leading this charge towards majority rule and independence. And English as well is maybe a colonial language, but at least English is a language that they are familiar with, and also it is an international language. You can tell its utility beyond the borders of South Africa in a way that Afrikaans can't. So the students, high school students, by the way, middle and high school students, those age groups, took to the streets of Soweto to protest this, okay? To protest this in 1976. And they were mowed down, you know, for lack of a better term. They were mowed down, you know, shot down with reckless abandon by the South African Defense Forces and the police. And 165 students, 165, mostly children, were shot down in 1976. And to this day, that date, 16 June 1976, 16 June is celebrated as the Day of the African Child across the continent, or Youth Day. And this is an image that is famous from there, from that event. And the boy being carried here, his name is Hector Peterson. He had been shot. And this brother was this was another guy from the community who carried him home. And the lady's crying next to him here is his sister. And I'll put the link to that story here. But it became the iconic image of the 1976 riots. And after that, you know, public and international backlash just continued to grow. This made the news around the world, and anybody who had been on the fence about apartheid after seeing this, you know, it was over for them. You know, the following year in 1977, Steve Biko, who had been arrested, died in prison, and it was claimed that he had committed suicide as part of a hunger strike, but he had incredible injuries, which I have a description of some of his injuries here. It's according to autopsy, an extensive brain injury had caused centralization of the blood circulation to such an extent that there had been an intravasal blood coagulation, acute kidney failure, and uremia. So that's how he died. Hunger strike? Does that sound like a hunger strike to you? It's ridiculous, right? So anyway, he had died in prison in 1977. So again, you put that in the context of the Soweto riots the year before, then Steve Biko being killed. And also, this was not an isolated incident, right? Steve Biko was the 21st person to die in a South African prison in 12 months, and the 46th political detainee to die under interrogation since the government introduced laws permitting imprisonment without trial in 1963. 46 political prisoners in a little over 10 years. And if you ever watch, and this is for the popular audience, first of all, Steve Biko's story is told pretty decently, you know. I have my issues with it, but we can talk about those at a later date. In the story, I believe, Cry Freedom, in which Denzel Washington portrays him. So if you are interested in learning a little more about him from a very popular culture sort of standpoint, I would recommend watching that. And the story of the Soweto uprisings is told in the musical Sarafina, which features the likes of Whoopi Goldberg. And again, it's a musical and it's made for a popular audience. So take both those movies with that in mind, that, you know, they play fast and loose with some histories, but they do capture the essence of the story. So I recommend those. But I say that because at the end of Sarafina, I believe, at the end of, yeah, Sarafina, they list the people who had been killed, the political prisoners. And if you just see the number of them that said he died, he committed suicide, or, you know, he banged himself, he banged his head against the wall, these sort of things, it's so obvious that there is no way this is really happening. And Steve Biko had famously told people that he would never commit suicide, so nobody was buying that. So that's a little bit about the 1970s in South Africa. So what happened? How did it end? There were several reasons why South Africa, why apartheid ended up falling. The first one here is increasingly, remember we said earlier, Porco and MK couldn't really catch on because of the urban emphasis on South Africa and the fact that the South African society was set up in such a way that it had good control of its urban areas. Add to that the state of emergency and passed laws. However, what else? Let me see here what some of the things that helped break this resistance were. In the beginning in 1980, Nelson Mandela's wife at the time, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, took leadership of ANC's township and urban protesting, right? Through which they would disrupt, you know, they would sabotage different spaces, you know, demonstrations, bombing of places, protests, violence, these sort of things. I'm trying to see if we can find a description of some of the things here, where some of the things that they got into. In any case, so you can imagine that sort of urban space where there's always riots, there's always violence, there's always disruption, there's always, you know, the state just became ungovernable. I wish I could find the quote here, but in any case, and she was arrested time and time again, but they kept doing that, and such that by 1985, the townships had become ungovernable, and the president declared a state of emergency in those select townships. Hundreds, dozens, and thousands were detained in the security clampdown that followed, but there was no relenting, you know. Secondly, so Winnie Mandela and other people, urban activists, made the townships ungovernable. The second thing that happened was international pressure continued to mount, right? Especially in the aftermath of the Soweto riots and these other things. Economic sanctions, which saw the rand drop drastically, and the rand had been a dominant currency. And even the US for a long time had, you know, there's a quote from the Carter administration, I believe, maybe the Reagan administration, in which they said we must not sacrifice our relationship with white South Africa. A large part of why, other than those kinships, those white kinships, another reason why they wanted to maintain those relationships was because this was in the thick of the Cold War, and they knew that if they could keep South Africa capitalist, it would not fall the way of the communists, and that was important for them. So for a long time, the US even backed South Africa, but in the 1980s, it was becoming too much. So capital was also fleeing the country as people divested from the country, including the likes of Pepsi, which famously did so. Different major companies divested from the country. And similarly, in an international pressure was put in place by Pan-African effort, by this large Pan-African effort. And one of the ways in which that was done was by what we call the frontline states, which was a group of neighboring countries, initially consisting of Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Tanzania, and Zambia. Then Angola and Mozambique and Zimbabwe joining at the attainment of their independence. And it availed itself as a place of refuge and counsel for political leaders, militants, and civilians of the remaining colonies, right? So Namibia and South Africa mainly. So the countries would, these frontline states for South Africa, activists would go and spend some time there in exile, or they would organize, the MK and the POPCO would organize from the vantage point of these frontline states. And the frontline states would also put political pressure, right, appeal to the rest of the international community to alienate this apartheid government so they could bring it down. These frontline states also made up what has been described as a second front of the struggle. The neighboring countries' involvement in the anti-apartheid activity saw the death of more than 100,000 people between 1980 and 1986, 100,000 people in those other countries, and displaced more than 1 million, and cost the region more than $90 billion US dollars, a figure more than 3 times the region's GDP for the 1980s. So the neighboring countries, we're talking about Rhodesia, we're talking about Mozambique, we're talking about these countries, they paid a huge price in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. So that there was also a large Pan-African effort. And taking Pan-African to a next level, on 2nd November in 1985, for example, Jesse Jackson of the US and Oliver Tambo, who was Mandela's mentor, addressed a crowd of 30,000 in London in what many described as the biggest anti-apartheid rally. So you can do your own research and find what was going on in the 1980s in the fight against apartheid. Then famously, the loss of Namibia, which had been occupied and ruled by South Africa since they took it from Germany in the Second World War, which is something in the First World War, sorry, something we've spoken about here. It had been, so Namibia had been a large resource space for, South Africa got a lot of its resources from Namibia. So there was a war in the 1980s in which South Africa invaded southern Angola to, and the large part of that was like because Angola was starting to lean communist. So the South Africans invaded them in a bid to convince the people, the white electorate, that it was taking the security war to the real enemy, the foreign black communist hordes of its propaganda imagination. However, the Angolans had the backing of the Cubans, and they essentially won that war. And the South African government was forced to the negotiating table. And with American mediation, it agreed to end its long-term illegal occupation of Namibia in exchange for the safe evacuation of its stranded troops in Angola and the phased withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola. And once accepted, this led quickly to the free elections of Namibia in 1990. And once that happened, right, a large part of the country, of their governance, Namibia, lost. It was just a matter of time. And the last major thing that happened, so that's 4 things. One, the townships made ungovernable, international pressure, the Pan-African effort, the loss of Namibia, and also now de Klerk, right, F.W. de Klerk takes office in 1989, as part of the apartheid government. But however, even though he is still a part of the apartheid government, is a far cry from the likes of P.W. Botha, who I believe P.W. Botha gave the famous speech in which he said, in which he derided black people and said that they have nothing in common with white people in as far as, they're as different from white people as lizards are to alligators. and they are good for nothing, they are lazy, and all these things. I've made a video on this as well, which is the very first video on this channel, so you can go and see some of that rhetoric. So de Klerk comes in to replace him, and this is after P.W. Botha had a strike, because God don't like ugly. But de Klerk takes office in 1989 and is more moderate, and he puts in place critical reforms and releases the likes of Mandela from prison in 1990. And that's a famous picture with Nelson and Winnie Mandela upon Nelson Mandela's release here. And some of the other things that he did was he lifted the state of emergency. He unbanned the political parties, among many other things. This is all in 1990. Then the transition to democratic elections was prolonged, lasted for 4 years until 1994. And in the interim of that, there was a lot of violence, which I won't get too much into right now, because I just wanted to talk about how South Africa got around to getting its independence, and we can talk about that in another video. But this will suffice for the purposes of this lesson. So that's the fall of apartheid. So having said all that, let's talk about our big takeaways, right? Which three countries, let me see if I can come back here. Which three countries constituted the British Central African Federation, formed in 1953, right? There are three countries which I spoke about, one which was sort of the center of it, and its neighbor with a very similar name, where the copper belts are prominent, then another one where a lot of the labor came from. So there are those three countries. What is the Shona name for the Zimbabwean Wars of Independence, the second of which began in 1966? So the first one had happened in the 1890s, then the second one began in 1966, and it is also the inspiration for the song that we started the video with. What 1974 event in Europe led to the independence of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique? We said there had been a leader, a general in Africa, in Guinea, a Portuguese general who had seen some things that made him make this decision in Portugal, right, in Europe. What was that, the event that led to the independence of these countries? What 1955 South African document declared that the country belongs to all those who live in it? What were the Soweto uprisings about? Name any three critical factors that led to the end of apartheid. What is the name of the collective of neighboring South African states that actively advocated for the end of apartheid, among other things? So those are the key takeaways from this lesson. This is the last one in our series, so in our mini series of the overthrow of colonialism. Next week, I will do a balance sheet of colonialism and sort of like a debate to talk about how people speak about colonialism. So join me then. Other than that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, like, share, and subscribe it. It's been me, Dr. Shengema Vima, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.